When something unexpected happens in life, it can feel like the world is shifting beneath our feet. This is exactly how Marjorie Rieu must have felt when she found out about her husband's sudden diagnosis. Life was moving along just as it always had until that moment. The normal routines, the small joys, and the future they were building together suddenly came to an abrupt halt. It wasn't just the diagnosis that shocked them both, it was the realization that nothing would ever be the same again. Marjorie, someone who had always been known for her strength and resilience, now found herself at the center of an emotional storm she wasn't prepared for. Her husband, once full of life, now faced an uncertain and frightening future. This diagnosis, though medical in nature, felt like a heavy burden that would change their lives forever. The couple had spent so many years together, building memories and dreams, and now it felt as though all of that was hanging in the balance. The news left them both reeling, struggling to come to terms with a new reality that was so different from what they had imagined. It wasn't just the diagnosis itself that weighed heavily on her, it was the emotional toll of knowing her partner, the person she had shared so much with, was now facing a battle that she couldn't fight for him. This was one of the hardest things any person can experience, the realization that someone they love is in pain, and there is so little they can do to help other than offer their support. Marjorie, like many others in such situations, felt the helplessness creeping in. There was no way to reverse the situation, no way to undo the diagnosis. All that was left was to face it head-on together, with courage. But, in the midst of this overwhelming sadness, there was also a sense of deep love and devotion. Marjorie's world had just been shaken, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to leave her husband's side, she had vowed to stand by him through thick and thin, and this was the moment where that vow would truly be tested. It wasn't just about comforting him in the face of his diagnosis, it was about standing strong and being his pillar of support, even when the weight of the world seemed unbearable. As the days passed and reality set in, Marjorie found herself searching for the strength she didn't even know she had. She realized that in some ways, the hardest part of this journey wouldn't just be the physical challenges her husband faced, it would be the emotional challenges of watching someone you love struggle, knowing there's so little you can do to change the outcome. There were moments when she felt overwhelmed, unsure of how to keep going or what the future held. But it was during those moments of doubt that she found herself clinging to the love they had shared. It was that love that gave her the courage to face each day, even when the fear and uncertainty seemed all-consuming. It wasn't easy, and there were days when she wanted to give up, but she knew that walking away wasn't an option. Her husband needed her more than ever. As Marjorie faced this tragic turn in their lives, it wasn't just about managing her own emotions, it was about being strong for her husband, for the both of them. It was about embracing the vulnerability that came with such a diagnosis, and learning to navigate the unknown. For Marjorie, it meant learning to balance the fear and sadness with the hope that, despite everything, they could still find moments of peace and joy, no matter how small. It meant letting go of the fear of the future and embracing the present, even if it wasn't the future they had once envisioned. The process of coping with a diagnosis like this isn't linear. There are days when everything feels manageable, and then there are days when it feels like the weight of the world is too much to bear. Marjorie's journey through this experience was marked by a series of highs and lows, of moments where hope felt within reach, only to be followed by times when despair took hold. It's these ups and downs that create a deeper understanding of what it truly means to be human, to love, to struggle, and to find resilience, even when things seem impossible. What stands out in this journey is Marjorie's commitment to her husband. It's easy to talk about love in the abstract, but when faced with a crisis like this, the true strength of love becomes evident. It's in the quiet moments of support, in the late nights spent talking, in the small acts of kindness that keep a relationship strong. Marjorie knew that this journey wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to face it with him, side by side. It wasn't just about fighting the diagnosis, it was about living through it together, no matter what came their way. Her decision to stand by him during this difficult time reflects a deep understanding of what true partnership is. It's not always about the easy moments or the milestones, it's about showing up for each other when things are at their worst. It's about finding the courage to keep going even when the path ahead is uncertain. Marjorie's story is one of strength, love, and unwavering commitment. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the bonds we share with those we love can be the light that guides us through. The uncertainty of the future loomed large, but Marjorie refused to let that fear control her. She knew that life could change in an instant, but she was ready to face whatever came next with her husband by her side. This wasn't just about the diagnosis, it was about everything that came with it, from the emotional journey to the strength required to keep going. Through it all, one thing remained certain: their love for each other, which would be the foundation they built on as they faced the future together. It's hard to imagine the feeling of having your life turned upside down in an instant. For Marjorie Rieu, everything was going according to plan until the day she and her husband received that shocking diagnosis. One moment they were living their lives as they always had, making plans for the future, enjoying the simple things. And then out of nowhere everything changed. The diagnosis wasn't just a piece of news, it was a turning point. The kind of turning point that makes you question everything you thought you knew about your life, your future, and your relationship. The suddenness of it all created a whirlwind of emotions, fear, uncertainty, and a sense of loss. When they first received the news, it must have felt like a bad dream. Marjorie had probably never imagined she would face such a challenge with her husband. It wasn't something you ever prepare for, and when it happens, it can be impossible to grasp how quickly everything shifts. One moment they had a future filled with shared dreams and aspirations, and the next moment they were standing on the edge of an unknown, uncertain path. The diagnosis changed everything in a way that nothing else could. It wasn't just about the illness itself, it was about how this sudden change was going to affect their lives, their hopes, and their relationship. The shock of the diagnosis probably made it hard for Marjorie to process everything. When you're hit with news like this, your mind can race, and it's hard to know how to handle the emotions that follow. The first reaction is often disbelief. You don't want to believe it. You tell yourself that there must be some mistake, some misunderstanding, but deep down, you know that this is real. You know that this diagnosis will change the course of your life. It's in moments like these that everything starts to feel uncertain. What will happen next? Will things ever be the same again? The questions flood in, and the answers seem so far away. For Marjorie, that moment of uncertainty must have been overwhelming. The reality of the situation started to sink in slowly. As much as she wanted to hold on to the hope that everything would be okay, she had to come to terms with the fact that her husband's life, and her own, was about to take a dramatic turn. And yet it wasn't just about the future of her husband, it was about her own role in this new reality. What was she supposed to do now? How was she supposed to navigate this situation with so many unknowns? The questions kept coming, and so did the emotions. One moment Marjorie may have felt paralyzed by fear, unsure of how to proceed. The next she might have found herself clinging to the love and strength that had always defined her relationship. There was a deep sense of vulnerability now that they were facing something so beyond their control. The idea that her husband was now in a fight for his health was not something Marjorie could have prepared. It wasn't just his physical health that was at risk, it was their emotional connection, their shared future, their dreams together. The weight of it all must have been suffocating at times. But in the midst of the shock and the pain, there was one thing that kept Marjorie grounded: her love for her husband. Despite the overwhelming fear and the uncertainty that the diagnosis brought, Marjorie couldn't deny the bond she had with him. This love was the thread that kept her from falling apart. It was this love that reminded her that even in the darkest of times, there was something worth fighting for. Her husband wasn't just a person with an illness, he was the person she had built her life with. They had shared so much together, and now as they faced this new challenge, it was that shared history, that deep connection, that would help guide them through it. In the face of this terrifying uncertainty, Marjorie's first instinct was probably to support her husband. After all, this diagnosis wasn't just his battle, it was their battle. And yet there was something deeply unsettling about the situation. It wasn't just about coping with the illness, it was about coming to terms with the fact that the life they had once imagined for themselves was now uncertain. The plans they had made for the future seemed to be slipping away, and in its place was a future that was unpredictable and filled with unknowns. As the days passed and the reality of the diagnosis settled in, Marjorie had to adjust to a new way of living. There was no longer a clear path ahead, no longer the simple certainty of what the future might hold. Now everything was different. The challenges were no longer just physical, they were emotional and psychological as well. It wasn't just about caring for her husband in a physical sense, it was about caring for him emotionally and mentally, while also trying to take care of herself in the process. This was no small task. At the same time, Marjorie's role had shifted. She had always been a partner, someone who shared the joys and burdens of life. But now her role was different. She was no longer just a wife, she was a caregiver, a support system, and the person who would help her husband navigate this new and frightening chapter. This shift in roles likely brought its own challenges. Being strong for someone else while struggling to keep yourself together is no easy feat. There were probably moments when Marjorie felt like she was losing herself in the process. But there was also a deep sense of purpose in what she was doing. She was doing what she could to help her husband, and that was all that mattered. As Marjorie moved through this emotional landscape, she found herself questioning what was next. How would their lives change? What would their future look like? It's hard not to feel the weight of those questions when faced with something so unexpected, but the one thing that kept her going was the love they shared. No matter what lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't be facing it alone. She and her husband had built a life together, and that was something worth holding on to. The uncertainty was frightening, but it also gave Marjorie the opportunity to reflect on what truly mattered. What was most important in life? Was it the plans they had made, or was it the love they shared in the present? This diagnosis had forced her to confront these questions head-on. And in the process, Marjorie realized that while the future was uncertain, the love they had was something that could never be taken away. No matter what happened, they still had each other. That realization, though not making the situation any easier, gave her a sense of peace amidst the storm. As the diagnosis continued to shape their lives, Marjorie was learning to embrace the uncertainty. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew that she would face it with the person she loved most in the world. And that, in the end, was enough to keep her moving forward. When life takes an unexpected turn, it can often leave you feeling as if everything you once knew is now slipping away. This was the reality for Marjorie Rieu when her husband was diagnosed with a tragic illness. The moment the diagnosis came in, it wasn't just a piece of news, it was a jarring reminder that life could change in an instant in a way that no one could have predicted. For Marjorie and for many others facing similar circumstances, the diagnosis was not just a medical condition, it was a life-altering event that would test her in ways she could never have imagined. Marjorie's immediate reaction was likely one of shock. No one prepares for this kind of news. It's something that hits you from out of nowhere, leaving you unprepared for the emotional and mental journey that follows. When we hear about someone we love being diagnosed with a serious illness, it often feels like the world stops. All of the everyday things that once seemed so important fade into the background, and suddenly there's only one thing that matters: your loved one's health and well-being. The rest of the world can seem distant and irrelevant when you're faced with something so personal and so overwhelming. The shock Marjorie must have felt in those first moments after hearing the diagnosis would have been immense. There are so many questions that flood your mind when you're told that someone you love is facing a serious illness. How serious is it? What does the future look like now? How long do we have? And perhaps the hardest question of all, what will our lives look like now that everything has changed? The questions come fast and furiously, and yet the answers are often nowhere to be found. For Marjorie, these questions must have been a constant presence in her mind. How would her husband cope with his diagnosis? How could she help him through this? What would her role be now? These questions would have been difficult to answer, especially in the midst of such a painful and uncertain time. There is no clear roadmap for handling a situation like this, no simple way of knowing what the right steps are. All she could do was take things one day at a time and try to navigate the uncertainty. In the days that followed, as Marjorie faced the reality of her husband's diagnosis, she likely found herself grappling with a mix of emotions. One moment, she might have felt a deep sense of sadness and fear for the future, and in the next she might have felt a surge of strength and determination to help him through this difficult time. The journey through such a crisis is rarely linear. There are moments of hope and strength, followed by moments of doubt and fear. It's the kind of emotional roller coaster that can feel impossible to handle, especially when there are no guarantees about what the future holds. But in the midst of all this uncertainty, one thing remained clear for Marjorie: her deep love for her husband. It was this love that became the foundation of her strength. Even though the future seemed unclear and the diagnosis felt overwhelming, she knew that she couldn't abandon him. Love in its purest form is a force that can carry you through even the darkest of times. Marjorie in this moment had to dig deep into that love to find the strength to face each new day. Her role had changed in an instant. Marjorie wasn't just a wife now, she was a caretaker, a source of comfort and strength for her husband. It was no longer just about the life they had planned together, it was about helping him through this illness and making sure he had the support he needed. Her husband needed her now more than ever, and Marjorie had to adjust to this new role, one that she may not have been prepared for. The truth is that caregiving, especially when it's for someone you love deeply, can be both rewarding and incredibly challenging. It requires patience, strength, and an ability to cope with emotions that can sometimes feel overwhelming. One of the most difficult aspects of Marjorie's situation would have been the constant fear of the unknown. When you're faced with a diagnosis like this, it's impossible to predict what the future will bring. There's no way of knowing exactly what your loved one will go through or how the illness will progress. For Marjorie, the uncertainty must have been a source of constant stress. Every day she would have had to face the possibility that things might get worse, and that fear would have undoubtedly weighed on her heart. It's the kind of uncertainty that can make even the smallest decisions feel monumental. Every choice she made, from how to support her husband to how to handle the emotional toll it was taking on her, would have been clouded by that fear of the unknown. Despite the fear and uncertainty, Marjorie had no choice but to keep going. There was no other option but to face each day, to support her husband, and to try to stay strong for both of them. And yet, in those moments when she felt overwhelmed, she would have had to remind herself that she wasn't alone in this journey. Her husband needed her, but she also needed him. The love and connection they shared had to be the foundation that kept them going. Marjorie's story is one that many can relate to. When faced with the possibility of losing someone you love, it forces you to confront your own vulnerabilities and your own fears. You begin to realize just how fragile life is and how much you depend on the people around you. But you also discover something incredible, the strength that you never knew you had. Marjorie's deep love for her husband became the driving force that allowed her to push through the fear and uncertainty. It was that love that helped her to be there for him when he needed her most. The emotional toll of the situation would have been hard to bear at times. It's not easy to watch someone you love struggle, especially when you feel so helpless. But even in those moments of doubt and fear, Marjorie knew that she couldn't give up. She had made a promise to her husband, a promise to stand by him through thick and thin, and this was the time to honor that promise. Through the course of her husband's illness, Marjorie likely learned a lot about herself. She learned about the depths of her own strength, the strength that can only come from love. She learned about the importance of staying present in the moment, of taking things one day at a time. She learned that even when the future is uncertain, it's the love we give and the love we receive that can carry us through. And through all the heartache and fear, she found that this love was something worth fighting for. The road ahead would not be easy. Marjorie knew this, but she also knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The future was uncertain, but the love they shared was something that could never be taken away. And it was this love that would help them both navigate the difficult days ahead. When someone you love is going through something painful, there is an emotional toll that can be hard to describe. For Marjorie Rieu, the moment her husband's diagnosis was revealed, it wasn't just a piece of news, it was a sudden and overwhelming shift that left her grappling with the reality that everything they had planned, every dream they had shared, could be at risk. In the midst of that moment, when everything felt like it was crumbling around her, the one thing that stood out was the word goodbye. This wasn't just about saying farewell to their usual life, it was about something far deeper and more emotional, a goodbye to the way things were before. It's easy to say goodbye, but when you're facing something like this, the emotional weight is much heavier than it appears on the surface. Saying goodbye to the life they once had together wasn't just about moving on from the physical aspects of their life, it was about acknowledging that the life they had envisioned was about to change, perhaps permanently. Marjorie must have been struggling with the reality of that moment, realizing that this goodbye wasn't just about the physical changes in her husband's health. It was about an emotional goodbye to a future they had planned together, a future that was now uncertain. The word goodbye carries so much emotion, especially in the context of an illness like this. It brings up feelings of loss, fear, and sadness. Saying goodbye is never easy, but saying goodbye to something that has been such a huge part of your life is even harder. For Marjorie, the goodbye she was facing wasn't just to the life she had known, it was to the idea of a future that was now unpredictable. It was hard to imagine what life would look like without the certainty they once had. The moment her husband's diagnosis was revealed, everything they had dreamed about together felt distant and uncertain. It wasn't just about the illness, it was about the emotional and mental shift that came with it. Marjorie's heart must have been filled with so many mixed emotions. On one hand, there was the sadness of realizing that the future they had once envisioned together was now in question. On the other hand, there was a deep sense of love and commitment. Her husband needed her more than ever, and she couldn't just walk away from him. Love like that doesn't give up in times of hardship. Marjorie had spent so many years with him, and their bond was built on something deeper than just shared memories. It was built on a promise they had made to each other, to support one another, no matter what. The goodbye that Marjorie was facing wasn't just a goodbye to the past, it was a reminder that they would face whatever came next together. But it wasn't easy. Saying goodbye to the life they had known meant letting go of the small moments they had shared, the routines that had defined their daily lives, and the future they had hoped to build. It was about facing the fact that some things might never be the same again. The uncertainty that came with her husband's diagnosis created a shift in the way they would approach life. They couldn't plan for the future the way they used to. They couldn't take things for granted anymore. Every moment felt more precious, and that preciousness was tied to the awareness that life was fragile. In moments like these, it's natural to want to hold on to what you can. You want to find comfort in the things that remain the same. But Marjorie had to learn that holding on wasn't always possible. It wasn't about holding on to the past, it was about facing the new reality and adjusting to the changes that were coming. The goodbye to the life they had once known was not an easy one, but it was something that needed to happen for both of them to move forward. The future wasn't going to look the same as it did before, but that didn't mean it couldn't still be full of love and meaning. In the face of this profound change, Marjorie probably found herself asking a lot of questions. How could she make this transition easier for her husband? How could she help him through the difficult moments ahead? What would their relationship look like now? These questions were likely running through her mind as she navigated this new chapter of their lives. The idea of a goodbye was overwhelming, but it was also a reminder that change was inevitable. Life was forcing them to say goodbye to certain things, but it was also giving them an opportunity to say hello to a new way of living, a new way of facing the challenges ahead. Marjorie's emotional journey was filled with ups and downs. The sadness and grief she felt over the changes in their life were balanced by moments of love and connection. Every goodbye she said to the past was an opportunity to cherish what they still had in the present. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary for both of them to move forward. They had to let go of the old version of their life so they could fully embrace the new one, even though that new life came with its own set of challenges and uncertainties. Saying goodbye is often seen as an end, but for Marjorie and her husband, it wasn't really the end at all. It was the beginning of something different, a journey they would take together despite the hardships. There were still moments to share, still love to give, and still memories to make. The goodbye they were facing wasn't the end of their story, it was simply a new chapter, one that would require them to adapt and find strength in each other. In the midst of saying goodbye to the life they had once known, Marjorie discovered that there were still things worth holding on to. The bond they shared, the love they had for each other, and the commitment to facing the future together, these were the things that would sustain them through the tough days ahead. The goodbye to the past didn't mean giving up on their relationship or their love. It meant adjusting to a new reality, one that was filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. Marjorie's journey through this emotional goodbye was not just about loss. It was about finding new ways to appreciate the moments they still had, to cherish the love that remained, and to continue building a life together, even in the face of illness. The goodbye was painful, but it was also a necessary step toward healing, growth, and rediscovery. It reminded them both that, no matter what changes life threw their way, they would face them together, with love as their guiding force. When someone we love is diagnosed with a serious illness, the way we look at the future changes. It's almost as if time itself begins to stretch, making the moments we have left feel even more precious. Marjorie Rieu found herself facing this reality with her husband's tragic diagnosis. The road ahead was unknown, and it wasn't just her husband who was affected, it was their whole life, their entire future, and everything they had once hoped for. Each day felt like it carried more weight than the last, and yet in the midst of all this uncertainty, Marjorie began to notice something that she hadn't fully recognized before. The true strength of her bond with her husband was being revealed in ways she hadn't anticipated. It's one thing to go through life together, sharing the ups and downs, the laughter and the challenges, but it's something else entirely to face a crisis of this magnitude and still find ways to hold on to each other. Marjorie's story was no longer just about dealing with the logistics of her husband's illness, it was about discovering a strength they both had that would guide them through the darkest of days. There's a kind of strength that emerges in times of crisis, a strength that doesn't come from physical ability but from emotional and mental resilience, and it was this strength that would define their journey going forward. As her husband's condition worsened, Marjorie likely found herself asking how they would navigate this new reality. What did life look like now, with so many unknowns? The future that once seemed so full of possibilities now seemed uncertain. Yet, amid all of this uncertainty, there was one thing that remained clear: Marjorie's deep love and commitment to her husband. This love became the foundation for everything they faced. It wasn't just about the care and support she could give him physically, though that was essential. It was also about being there emotionally, providing him with the reassurance and strength he needed. In the hardest of moments, love becomes the thing that helps you push forward, even when you feel like you can. Marjorie's role had changed in ways she never imagined. Before the diagnosis, she and her husband had a life that they built together, a life they could plan around their shared dreams. But now the plans they had made together seemed distant. The future they had once hoped for was clouded by the harsh reality of illness. And yet, despite these changes, the emotional connection they shared didn't fade. It only grew stronger. The new reality that Marjorie found herself in required her to adapt to a completely different kind of relationship with her husband. This was no longer just about companionship, it was about being the person who would support him through the toughest days of his life. Quote. It's easy to look at a situation like this and feel like giving up, especially when the future feels uncertain and the burden seems so heavy. There were moments when Marjorie must have felt overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what she was dealing with. But even in the darkest moments, when she may have felt like everything was falling apart, there was still something deep within her that kept her going. It was the love she had for her husband and the deep bond they shared. This bond wasn't something that could be broken by an illness or by the challenges life threw their way. It was something much deeper, something that would guide them through the hard days ahead. Marjorie must have also found herself questioning how to best help her husband. Was there a way to make the situation easier for him? How could she provide him with the comfort and support he needed? These questions likely weighed on her as she tried to figure out how to navigate the days ahead. It's a question that many caregivers face. How do you care for someone else when you feel like you're also struggling? It's not an easy question to answer, and the weight of it can feel unbearable at times. But Marjorie's love for her husband gave her the strength to keep going, even when the road ahead seemed impossible. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Marjorie began to realize that the situation wasn't something she could control. There was no way to predict how her husband's condition would progress, or how their lives would change from one day to the next. But one thing she could control was how she responded. She could choose to face each day with love, with strength and with hope. Even in the face of an uncertain future, she could choose to be there for her husband, to stand by him no matter what came their way. In some ways, Marjorie's situation was about learning to embrace the unknown. It was about accepting that life wasn't going to be what they had planned, but still finding ways to make it meaningful. They couldn't go back to the life they once knew, but they could still find joy in the moments they had left. In those moments, Marjorie likely found herself focusing more on the present than the future. The future felt too uncertain, but the present was something she could hold on to. Each day, each moment spent with her husband, became a gift, even if it was wrapped in sadness and fear. The love they shared became the driving force that kept them moving forward. When everything else seemed uncertain, that love was something they could both rely on. Marjorie's husband might not have been able to control his illness, but he could still control how he faced it, with the support of his loving wife. And in turn, Marjorie found that her love for him gave her the strength to face each new challenge. This part of Marjorie's journey wasn't just about surviving the illness, it was about learning to live in a way that still had meaning. They couldn't avoid the pain and uncertainty, but they could still find ways to make the most of their time together. There was still love to be shared, even if it was now intertwined with grief and fear. The future might have been uncertain, but their love was certain, and that was enough to carry them through. Marjorie quote. Its story is one of finding strength in the face of adversity. It's about discovering that even when life is uncertain, love can be the thing that keeps you moving forward. Through every challenge, every setback, and every hard day, love was the thing that held them together. It was the thing that reminded them both that, no matter what happened, they weren't alone. It wasn't the future they had planned, but it was still a future worth fighting for. And through all the uncertainty, one thing remained clear: love always has the power to guide us through even the darkest of times. Facing a challenge like a serious illness is never easy, and for Marjorie Rieu it meant not only coming to terms with her husband's diagnosis, but also facing a new reality that neither of them was prepared. Each day felt uncertain, filled with questions that didn't have answers. There's a strange thing about a diagnosis like the one Marjorie's husband received. It's as though time slows down and everything you once took for granted suddenly seems fragile and uncertain. For Marjorie, the question that weighed most heavily on her mind was how she could help her husband through this. But beyond that, she also had to figure out how to keep her own strength intact while navigating this new chapter of their lives. When you love someone deeply, you want to protect them from pain, from hurt, and from the harsh realities that life throws your way. But what happens when there's nothing you can do to stop the pain? This is where Marjorie found herself. There was no way to reverse the diagnosis, no way to make her husband's suffering disappear. The helplessness she must have felt in those early moments was unimaginable. The person she had built her life with was now facing something she couldn't protect him from. And yet, in the midst of this feeling of helplessness, there was something else emerging. A quiet, unshakable strength. As Marjorie watched her husband struggle with his diagnosis, she was faced with a difficult question: how do you keep going when everything feels like it's falling apart? It's a question many people face when they are thrust into the role of a caregiver. You don't get to choose the circumstances you face. Life presents you with challenges that can seem impossible to overcome. But what Marjorie began to realize is that even in the face of all this uncertainty, there was still room for hope. It wasn't hope in the sense of pretending that everything would be okay, but hope in the sense of choosing to keep moving forward, choosing to stay strong even when the road ahead seemed dark and full of fear. For Marjorie, the hardest part was likely not just the illness itself, but the constant fear of the unknown. How much time did they have left? Would her husband get better, or would the illness take away the man she loved? These questions are the ones that haunt you when you're confronted with a serious illness. The future is no longer something you can plan for. It becomes this big question mark hanging over everything you do. It's easy to feel paralyzed by fear when faced with such uncertainty. The future is no longer something to look forward to. It's something you dread because you don't know what it holds. But in the midst of this uncertainty, Marjorie found that she had to focus on the present. There was no way to know what the future would bring, but she could still make the most of the time they had now. She could choose to be present for her husband, to offer him the love and support he needed. Each day became a gift, not because it was perfect, but because it was a day they could share together. In the face of fear, Marjorie learned that there was still value in the small moments. The little things like sitting together in silence, holding hands, or just being there for each other, became the most important things in their world. What Marjorie likely realized over time was that she couldn't control the outcome of her husband's illness, but she could control how she responded to it. She could choose to face each day with love and courage, no matter how hard it became. And this was no small feat. There were days when the weight of the situation would have felt unbearable, when it might have seemed easier to just give up and let the sadness take over. But Marjorie didn't do that. She found a way to keep moving forward, one step at a time, even when she felt overwhelmed. And in doing so, she showed the power of resilience and love. In the beginning, it was likely difficult for Marjorie to see the light at the end of the tunnel. There were so many questions and fears surrounding the diagnosis. How much longer would they have together? Would her husband be able to cope with what was happening? These were questions without answers, and that kind of uncertainty is difficult to live with. But over time, Marjorie began to realize that the answers didn't matter as much as the love they shared. The future was unknown, but the present was something they could hold on to. No matter what came next, they had each other. Marjorie quote. Journey was a reminder that we don't always have control over the challenges we face in life, but we do have control over how we choose to respond. She could have easily given in to the fear and the uncertainty that came with her husband's diagnosis. She could have allowed herself to be consumed by the unknowns of the future, but instead she chose to focus on the present. She chose to love, to care, and to be there for her husband in ways that were meaningful. In doing so, she found that the simple act of being present was one of the most powerful tools she had in this fight. As the illness continued to take its toll, Marjorie and her husband likely faced many difficult days ahead. There would be times when it felt like the world was closing in, and the weight of everything they were going through was almost too much to bear. But it was in those moments that Marjorie would have had to rely on her inner strength. She would have had to remind herself that it was okay to not have all the answers, that it was okay to not know exactly what would happen next. What mattered most was that she was there, by her husband's side, offering him love and support in whatever way she could. One of the most powerful things Marjorie likely discovered throughout this journey was the power of love. Love is something that doesn't disappear, even in the hardest times. It doesn't fade when things get difficult. Instead, love becomes stronger in the face of adversity. The more she cared for her husband, the more she realized that love was the thing that would carry them through. It wasn't the diagnosis that defined their journey. It was the love they shared that would guide them through the toughest days. In the end, Marjorie's story is about the strength of the human spirit and the unbreakable bond of love. When faced with the most difficult challenge of her life, Marjorie found the courage to keep going. She didn't have all the answers, and the future was uncertain, but she chose to be there for her husband in every way she could. And in doing so, she showed that even in the darkest of times, love can be the thing that keeps us going.